Welcome back to Trusted Transitions. In the studio with me now is Michelle Fitzgerald. She's the local owner of Horizons Law Group in Brookfield. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning.
So, Michelle, today house flipping is a popular trend in this country. We tend to hear about the success stories and the profits of local investors who, do the renovating and the selling of the homes, but we often don't hear about the legal challenges. So we were kind of hoping today you could walk us through some of those challenges when investors decide to take on a flip project. I thought before we jump into that, I could just briefly, if that's okay, do the review on the couple of different types of flips that we see in the market. What I see primarily are three types, right? I see the cosmetic flip, and this is more of a low to, moderate risk strategy. And this is where the investor is really just doing the paint, updating paint, flooring, lighting fixtures. So it's kind of, just visual, not structural integrity kind of stuff, right? Then we see more of the second one is more of the major value add flip. And that's where they're replacing, floors, foundations, actually tearing down walls, right? A lot more work involved. And then the third is the wholesaling strategy, where we see it's really not a flip strategy because the investor who is acquiring that property is really just assigning that contract to another investor who will then do the flip the repairs and then market it. So I suppose all these different strategies and this must open up the door to just a lot of legal challenges. So we thought we would have you, our local expert, on to maybe open our eyes to what some of these challenges might be.
Right. I mean, I think of it in terms of the buyer, a lot of times more so when we're looking at those kinds of investments and then turnaround, because when the buyer thinks something was not disclosed or not told to them or whatever, then there can be a problem, for the investor and who's the seller. So it as buyers, they're going to want to check was their permits taken or were permits required for the work done. Probably for the cosmetic flip, there isn't necessarily permits are not necessary, but for the value added flip, a lot of times there is. If you're taking walls down or if you're renovating a kitchen or a bathroom or updating electrical or changing the plumbing, stuff like that, those all require permits. So that's going to want to be taken. And of course, as the investor, you can always say you're selling as is and whatnot, but that it can still come with sometimes when people do a cosmetic flip really to hide structural issues, maybe like seepage of basement walls, they paint over it to kind of hide some of that effervescence and prior staining of water damage, and so that can be a problem because then it appears that the investor who maybe thought they could just do a quick cosmetic update and then turn it over for a nice profit could be sued for intentional misrepresentation, where they say, well, I didn't live here, so I don't really know the issues. But if they painted over stuff, and to try to hide stuff, that can actually be like a civil lawsuit issue for intentional misrepresenting it to look like it's a clean, fresh basement when it in fact has known issues just by the presence of things they covered up. So those are some of the I would say legal challenges that I would say there.
What about on the with financing rules? I mean, I recently was made aware that there's this FHA 90-day flip rule, right? Where with that type of financing, you've got to be aware, I guess, that you can't flip that property in 90 days. You got to hold on to it longer. Is that the primary one on that folks need to be aware of? Are there other, I guess, rules on the financing side or lending restrictions?
Sure. I'm not an expert on the different mortgage products, but that's a very good tip that you have to be careful of which kind of mortgage you have. A lot of the first-time home mortgages are going to be something like that, where you might get a slightly reduced rate, but then you're kind of you're viewed as like they're giving you this because they view you to be going to be in this home and
Hmm.
be a homeowner and living there, not just flipping it. But the other aspect with that though is timing in terms of taxes, because if you are going to flip it and you do it in a without owning it 12 months, you're now looking at a short-term gain. Short-term capital
That's a
gains
good point.
are taxed at a much higher rate. So
Mm.
if you keep it at least 12 months, then you can be in the long-term capital gains tax rate, which is lower.
Right.
And on top of that, if you actually do live in it for 2 out of 5 years, you could then claim it as that you're selling your own homestead and avoid the capital gains altogether. And so some people think, oh, they could, buy a home and live in it and rehab it and sell it every 2 years. Well, you technically can't. It's 2 out of the last 5 years. So it's really sort of like a 5 year thing.
Hmm.
You could do it every 6 years because you could start that 2 years in the fifth year and then you're selling in the sixth year. So that, people have to just kind of be a little careful about that in terms of the taxable requirements, on the flip, whether it's the cosmetic or the value added or whatnot.
Do you have a recommendation in terms of business structure, like how to organize, how to set up? If it's a new investor that's just getting into this, should they have an LLC? Is there a particular business structure they should look to set up?
Yeah, I mean, an LLC can really help, limit the liability from their personal aspect, from their personal side. I mean, if they have workers and whatnot that are there and someone gets hurt or someone's walking by and trips on a board that was, left out when they're doing the rehab, you do want to have liability. I always say the first line of defense is liability insurance. So whether that's
Hmm.
general liability insurance for your, quote, business, which is the flipping, you
Hmm.
definitely have to have that because there can be any kind of claim of the nature that I just, mentioned. That's really your first line of defense. And then secondly would be like saying it's, owned by an LLC, which then if there was a lawsuit that maybe exceeded the insurance limitations, there would be protection from going after your personal assets because they could really only go after the assets owned, by the LLC. Some other pitfalls with that though is that if you're investing with a friend or a business partner,
Hmm.
you definitely want to have like a clear written agreement that states maybe who's putting in what, in terms of dollars or
Hmm.
work effort or what have you, and
Hmm.
and that when a place sells, what each party is receiving
Sure.
and title when you buy it. So sometimes I've heard people have said, yeah, I invested with so and so, and we did have a clear written agreement. But at the closing, when it was purchased, before we, cleaned it up and flipped it, I wasn't there or whatever. And so it ended up just being in the other person's name or the other person's business. And unbeknownst to me, or I knew that, but I just didn't worry about it. But then when we finished all the work and clean up and then went to sell, the person was like, well, it's in my business name and I don't, and I'm going to give you $10,000. I'm going to keep the other 100,000 or whatever the
Right.
profit is. And sometimes it's like you have to weigh then. Yeah, you could sue because maybe you had a written agreement, but it depends how long, they say, oh, take it or leave it. If you don't like it, I'll give you nothing.
Right. And the cost of
And
that litigation can be substantial in the time, right?
and the time, I mean,
Yeah,
someone might have said, no, I need that 50 grand that I invested with you
right,
because I need to pay for my son's college or I need to,
right.
this and that. So they can't wait 2 years or whatever for the litigation to conclude
Wow.
to
Yeah, I
receive
can
their
see
funds.
how
So.
getting some advice from you prior to going into some of this stuff would be a really good idea. What about, a lot of investors look instead of just flipping the property, they look to hold it and rent it out. I mean, Airbnb, we hear about Airbnb a lot. Can you just buy an investment property and Airbnb it? Is it that simple, or are there
Yeah, I mean,
hurdles investors need to look out for?
right. I mean, you could do you could just, get a straight lease and lease it out, but then you have to get very well versed on the landlord tenant laws in Wisconsin, which are
Hmm.
pretty strong
Hmm.
and very specific procedures. Or Airbnb, and Airbnb isn't as simple as cleaning it up and listing it. You actually should be permitted. I mean, if something happened or there was a fire or whatever,
Hmm.
and it was considered an illegal, short-term rental is what it's called for. what Airbnb, going through the government, it can seem like a pain, but usually the local authorities will give you the permit, no problem. But they first want you to fill out the state permit, and the state sometimes will send out an inspector, sometimes they don't, and just to make sure everything's up to code, electrical stuff like that, entrances, being wide enough, things like that. And then you get your permit from the state, and then you can complete your application with the local municipality. So
Right.
I definitely recommend that. But Airbnb is actually pretty good. They have insurance once you're, signed up with them, and they have an insurance as part of their fees that they take for, each rental. And so that's a nice benefit. They also do this rating system where, people say, well, what if a tenant, an Airbnb tenant holds over? Then do you have to go through the eviction process? Yes, in theory, but that person probably would never be able to use Airbnb again, right? So,
Mhm.
and if they want to ever do that, they're going to follow what rules and restrictions and time that they say they're renting it. So
Wow.
it can be a good
Well,
thing, but as long as
well,
you follow the law.
yeah, that's all great information. It's always great having you on, Michelle. If listeners wanted to get a hold of you, what phone number would they call?
262-432-3600 or horizonslaw.com.
Fantastic. Thanks again for being on. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back with more Trusted Transitions in just a minute.